Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Matthew DeBacco. Matthew received his bachelor's degree in pathology with a secondary degree in horticulture, then went on to receive a master's degree in agronomy in 2011 and a master's in education in 2014, both from the University of Connecticut. Then in 2020, he received his PhD from Ashford University. Matthew started the first cannabis course at a public university at the University of Connecticut. I first found out about Matthew from his research on powdery mildew with cucurbits using raw milk, as it was circulating around the giant pumpkin community. Matthew also enjoys growing giant pumpkins and has held the state record twice, with the largest weighing 1,885.5 pounds. In this episode, we talk about the similarities between the giant pumpkin community and the cannabis community, and how we might be able to utilize some of the advancements across the cultivation of these very different plants. Now on to the show. All right. Hey Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I've been a follower of you, and I've seen your name on bigpumpkins.com for years. I didn't, and this is on me, I didn't realize you were also producing content in the cannabis space as well. So I'm so excited that we were able to connect when I reached out to you. And I wanted to kind of hear a little bit about your journey, what you're up to, and then the topic you suggested, which is diving in about the comparisons between giant pumpkin growing and cannabis, which I think is going to be a fascinating topic. But let's just start off. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, so I teach at the University of Connecticut, and as well as some other universities, but I developed the cannabis course at the University of Connecticut. So the powers that be were very receptive to offering a new course in cannabis. I'd like to think, looking at all the data, I think it's the first public university to offer such a course. And this started back, I think 2019 is when it first came out. Of course, it took some prep to get to that point, but that was the first time we were able to offer a intro to cannabis course at a public university. So, it was lots of applause and excitement when we wheeled the plants into the lecture room on that first day. So that's always nice to see. But before I even got to that, how I even got in that position, I actually started with giant pumpkins. And I know cannabis growers and giant pumpkin growers may not seem like there's a lot of similarities, but there actually is. So I started hobby growing giant pumpkins simply because I wanted to grow, biggest pumpkin possible, shall we say. And this was, currently is my 24th year growing giant pumpkins. So it's been a little while, a lot of trial and error, early ages of the internet, early ages of sharing information, so a lot of trials and a lot of errors. But what kind of led that is I enjoyed growing things. So progressing with the pumpkins, and this was back when I was in high school, essentially, able to kind of choose my career path. So progressing on post high school to the university, I was looking at getting into plant science. And plant science, of course, growing things, but there's many different subcategories from there. Mm-hmm. So from there, I kind of progressed or favored the pathology, study of diseases. So I was in animal science courses learning about diseases and kind of relating them and crossing them over with plant science courses. That led then, after graduating there, to go on to a master's degree in agronomy, which is a study of growing field crops, and not necessarily focusing on nutrient per se, but looking more at the pathology, looking more at the diseases that impact economic crops. And I did a focus on tomatoes as well as cucurbits, which is, of course, your pumpkins and your squash. And if you've ever grown a pumpkin or a squash, pretty much they get white stuff on the leaves and it's powdery mildew. So I was looking at trying to organically suppress powdery mildew because it's such a broad disease. And anyone who's grown cannabis as well knows powdery mildew is very common on cannabis. So since this was early on in the legalization of things across the United States, my research paper, or my thesis, came up quite a bit, and I started being called in by indoor cannabis facilities. What made it difficult was becoming from the giant pumpkin or the field world into an indoor world is when all the control and all the different parameters that an indoor facility has. But all the plants that I saw, cannabis plants to start off, were all sick. I never went to a healthy grow because I was, quote, the plant doctor, the plant vet, see this plant, see the tomato, see an eggplant, see a pepper, see a cannabis plant. So I was approaching it from the disease aspect and offered a couple suggestions early on that happened to hit really well. And as a result, I kept getting called back, and one word of mouth spread to another person, and then ultimately ended up developing the course. I was offered to develop the course and went that route, and kind of now I'm living the double life of the cannabis production in the cannabis grow indoor facilities, as well as the outdoor production through the extension service that we have here in the state, as well as the hobbyist growers for giant pumpkins. So that was kind of a long kind of rendition there of about 20-ish, 24-ish or so years, but that's kind of what led me to where I am today.
And going back to the course at Connecticut, who is that course really directed for? Is it an in-person course? Can you take it online? I'm sure people will have a few questions about that.
So if you research, I think it's hemp production, University of Connecticut, type that into a search engine, probably find something about it. There's basically two modalities. During the typical college semester, which starts up end of this month, August, from August to December, January or so, I think December, should know my semesters. During the fall semester, that is the Introduction to Cannabis course. So that's like the basics of how to grow, how to produce. It's directed at new growers, people who don't have any interest in growing. I have some business majors that take it, some pharmacy majors that take it, who just want to know about the plant. Though the plant science majors do still learn something about it because they get to work with the plants during the fall semester. That then leads to the spring semester, which occurs right around January timeframe, and that is the advanced course, which is assuming you pass the intro course, you progress onto the advanced course, and we get to more of the details. Still able to grow the plant, where in the intro course, I handle all the pHing and all the watering and all of that. The advantage or the advanced course, the advantage is the students have passed the intro course, and it's kind of on the students' responsibility to keep the plants alive. I'm there as their consultant, and I direct them, of course, as we go through the semester, but they've got to decide when to flip it to flower, decide when to do a water change, decide what nutrients to add, what pH to run them at, and all those decisions. Now, that's for those that can be there at the University of Connecticut in stores in person during the fall and spring semester. However, I run the same courses during summer session 1 and summer session 2, and those are completely remote and online. So those can be taken by anyone in any state and really anywhere in the world, technically, because it's the same basic content. You don't get to work with the plants because of the limitations of being online, but you kind of get the same experience. I kind of try to do some discussion board postings, the same information, the same content that I pull from, of course, what the students experience in the semester to try to bring that experience as best I can across all the different states and rules and regulations so they can get a similar experience without necessarily actually touching and feeling the plants. So online in the summer session 1 and 2, intro and advanced, which is in the May to August timeframe, and then in person at the physical location of Stores, Connecticut in the August to early end of April, early May timeframe.
That's great. And then you also have a YouTube channel with an extensive collection of videos. I'm looking at it right now. You have over 100,000 subscribers, which is incredible. And
just broke that. Just got my silver play button, actually. So that was exciting monument.
Congratulations. Well deserved. And you have over 1,200 videos that you've published on there, many of which are part of the course itself. So that is an option for people as well. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so DeBacco University is the YouTube channel. It's broken into large playlists. So there's kind of like the intro to cannabis one. There's the advanced cannabis. I've also got agriculture because I also deal with some growers and farmers on the large scale. I also have a biology subset and a forensic science playlist on there. I have a student series where some of my students have been able to do some independent study work with cannabis. So I've tried to highlight some of their work, actually both working in the cannabis industry now. They've since graduated, but kind of trying to give them a little start there. But the goal of the channel there is really to provide the scientific-based information, scientific-backed information where we can. Now, of course, we always want to have it in more detail, and we always want to know all the answers to everything. There, of course, are limitations to that, but with the advent of the relaxation of some of the restrictions on cannabis, there's a lot more research coming out specifically on cannabis. So I am not only incorporated a lot of the content into my intro and advanced course, which you can find maybe not in a super organized way, but if you search the channel, you'll probably find a topic that's of interest to you. And I'm also now diving into more scientific papers as more research becomes available. So I do a lot of reading of scientific papers, some I like better than others. So if I feel that there's a quality resource that is published, and again, these take years of data and many scientists usually working on them, but they can be very intimidating to read. They're very difficult to read. It takes a different kind of mindset sometimes to read through them. So on my channel, some of the more recent videos, I read through them and I kind of give the grower synopsis, so the grower summary for those hardcore scientific information. I always link to the original article. So if you want to dive into more of the details or have some specifics about materials or methods or something they specifically did, of course you can find that. But I try to hopefully give you a little summary of what the researchers found and how that can relate to your own plants, how your own growing, and try to really utilize that scientific-based information to make sure you have an efficient grow and something that's based on actual information, not hearsay, or as a lot of people say on the channel, the bro science, if you will.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, let's dive in now with a little bit of the content. So one of the things that growers may not be as familiar with is the giant pumpkin world. So I was working with my father had started this compost tea company. And so I started looking on, this was infancy of online forums and things like that as well at the time. And so I started looking for places people were talking about compost tea. And the two places I found was an internet cannabis forum, icmeg.com, and then bigpumpkins.com. I'm still actually on both of those websites. And the similarities between the two groups is really quite fascinating. And at the time, let's give them a little bit of history about the giant pumpkin world. So at the time when I joined, we were talking about breaking the 1,000 pound barrier, I believe. So this kind of gives you an idea of what year it was, or around the time. And that was the big barrier. They're like, are we going to get there? You know, and then what that's going to look like. I know the current world record, what are we at now? Is it over 2,500 pounds?
Yep. 2,749, I believe.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Might be even 0.5. I don't know. It's 49.5, but it's 2,700 plus. Yeah.
So the passion, and this is going from seed to fruit in one season. So you literally get to see it grow. What were some of the breakthroughs, besides obviously genetics improving over the years? So a lot of it was breeding, I think, that contributed to these growth. But what were some of the cultivation, changes that were made that really allowed people to hit that next stage of growth, the next level?
So what's really helped, just in general, is just the sharing of information. And I find that very common in the giant pumpkin world. I'll have people, we do patch tours where literally in the summer we go out and we see 3-4 people's different patches. They invite a bunch of growers in, they show them what they're doing. And it's always nice to see the comparison of how different people handle different challenges. Being in Southern New England, I'll travel up to Vermont or Massachusetts or New Hampshire or Rhode Island, or even in Connecticut here, just having that, camaraderie and that kind of sharing of information, because despite being, out here, East Coast, and particularly in New England, a lot of small states. So you don't have to travel very far across the state border, but we have a lot of different soil types in this region. A lot of glacier moves to a lot of things, a lot of river systems. So there's a lot of variability in even a very small geographic area. So it's seeing how people basically dealt with those problems, being able to share information to see, what are you running your pH at? What is your nutrient levels at? What are your target levels? Great, you got a soil test. Well, what does that really mean? And having that really sharing of information has really been a big leg up, and really keeping a lot of the basics kind of in control, knowing how much water to give them. A lot of growers start off by not giving them too much water, and then they might flip to giving them too much water. So it's finding that kind of happy medium. And what's really allowed it, I think, to progress to the level that we're at is the true blending of the science information with the plant growing information. You'll find cannabis growers alike and giant pumpkin growers as well, that they do a lot of scientific reading, a lot of information, not just sticking a seed in the ground and watching it grow. That's how you might start, and that's a great way to start. But then it's always trying to beat your personal best. Yes, maybe you want to set a state record or a world record or something like that. But really the challenge is to beat yourself. Figure out whatever you grew the biggest and what can you beat that, and what can you do, and what improvements can you make? What efficiencies can, you tolerate? And of course, the weather is the great variable. So you'll notice, particularly with giant pumpkins, because they're grown pretty much outdoors in sun, there'll be different pockets or regions that typically have better success than others, just in general. You'll always get the one standout, which is always nice to see. But for the most part, weather does have an impact. But really what's allowed us to go from 1,000 pounds to now 2,000 plus pounds is that sharing of information in that utilizing of that scientific information to really drive and make decisions. A lot of growers are going to soil moisture meters, for example, knowing what's actually in the plant. For indoor growers, VPD, vapor pressure deficit's a big thing. Well, just having an idea of, even outdoors, we can kind of increase the humidity. We really can't reduce it, but we can increase it. So at what point do plants maybe like a little bit more humidity? How does that change when the plant is small versus when the plant is larger? How does that change in the early season versus the late season? And having growers that get success and really willing to share information. We've been fortunate in this region to have different growers set new world records, and we've always been very inviting, always, willing to share the information that they did. We've got other growers that, are growing over even in Europe. One just did a podcast. They've got some great ones growing right now. They've got several over 2,000 pounds by the measurements. So that's by the estimation weights. And, you could type questions into it. They were telling you what they did. Of course, specific to their conditions, because they're growing in a greenhouse, but they'll tell you what they're doing. They'll tell you, what target levels they're shooting for. So it just gives people a little bit wider appreciation for the plant and a little bit wider information burst to kind of have that idea of, ooh, someone did this. Let me maybe try that, or maybe look more into that. Maybe I'm missing something on that aspect. And then, of course, genetics and breeding, tracking those genetics. We can track them back into probably the mid to early 90s for most pumpkins. At that point now, we're going so many generations back, it probably doesn't make that much of a difference. But crossing pollinations, making those crosses, finding out what seeds are tendency to produce more orange pumpkins, heavier pumpkins, things like that. And it's the same thing in the cannabis industry. It's that genetics. Now, we're not as apt to clone giant pumpkins. I did some of that research when we were getting the first 2,000 pounder. I actually took a sample of the plant that grew the first 2,000 pounder, grew it in a greenhouse over the winter, and used that to kind of crossbreed into a couple things. So that's probably one of my more famous pumpkins, even though it only weighed 220 pounds. It went on that following year to produce 2 pumpkins in the top 10 world weights the following year, and that was just showed the power of genetics, that it came from very unique genetics. And yes, it was only a 220 pound pumpkin. It had the genetics of world records, and it really went on to produce more of the whiter pumpkins. I called it Snowball because that's what it looked like. It was grown in the winter. As giant pumpkin growers, we try to do everything we can in the summertime to cool our pumpkins. So I think it's the first ever pumpkin little flower that was cooled with packs of snow around it, because literally I went outside the greenhouse. We had big snowstorm. I packed snow around it, keep that area cool to help increase the odds of pollination. And it set and worked out quite well, and ended up with a 200-pound pumpkin that was hard to get out the door, believe it or not, in the greenhouse. So I had to work it through the door and got some seeds, sent them to different growers, and they were able to grow them that year. So yes, genetics play a role, sharing of information, and really just getting a bigger population or data set to figure out what really is ideal for these pumpkins.
Yeah, I had a slightly different experience or perspective, and I totally agree with you on the sharing information. Correct me if anything is wrong here in terms of my recollection of it or how I perceived it. But it seemed to me when I first started experiencing the giant pumpkin community, a lot of what was going on was it was a lot of like chemical growing, primarily, and a lot of experimentation. People were willing to try just about anything if someone did it, and they're called like heavy hitters is the term in the giant pumpkin community. If you grow at the time over, and they keep raising the bar of what that is, it might be 800 pounds, 1,000 pounds, 1,500, 2,000. And there's a special jacket that you can win. It's a whole thing. These people are so passionate. I mean, can you imagine dedicating an entire greenhouse literally for growing one or two pumpkins? It's incredible. So these people are very passionate. They're very smart, and they care deeply about what they grow. But what I found initially was it was a lot of chemical growing, and then people started incorporating back in, someone heard about mycorrhizal fungi, for example, and people started incorporating some organics back into it, looking at adding organic matter, high quality compost, and it's sort of this hybridization of organics and synthetics that has allowed larger yields, I guess, in a sense, if we want to compare it with cannabis. Let's talk about that for a second. I had a few other things I noticed, but what do you think about that?
So it comes down to the timing of application. I think this is true for cannabis as well as giant pumpkins. Early on, chemicals were, the quote unquote Miracle Grow blend was great because you add it and the next day your plants are super green and super tall and super big. And that's what we need, big, aggressive green plants. And it's we've now kind of shifted a little bit away from that, I would say, and utilizing that more when the soil is cold, when the microbes just can't quite manufacture as much nitrogen or make as many nutrients as available as the plant needs. So a little chemical early on, and then if needed, and then really relying on organic matter. Now, the old school of thought was, the ideal would be a 4-foot deep raised bed of just all the compost that you could get. We've shifted away from that because too much of a good thing is not a good thing. That brought about a lot of disease issues. That brought about a lot of water retention issues that we can't, quote, get rid of. That brought a lot of nitrogen, which for giant pumpkins can make the leaves really tall and big, which looks really impressive on, an Instagram post, but really doesn't do a lot of good for the plant. Makes it very brittle. And cannabis growers have the same thing. If you over add nitrogen and you walk by a plant and the branches usually just break, they don't have that nice kind of give, so to speak, to them. So seeing it shift towards more chemicals when needed in small doses early on to kind of get the plant initially going, and then utilizing the soil, because most are grown in some sort of soil base. Now that could be higher clay, higher sand, higher silt, again, depending on the region and the area, but usually amended, of course, with some organic matter. Now, the ideal target, depending on who you talk to, everyone will give you a different number. Looking at, I'd say, a minimum of like 5, 6, 7%, up to 10 to 12 would kind of be the theoretical range, if you will. But some growers have 20%, and it's a little harder to grow in that more consistently because it just holds so much more water, and you can get a lot of nitrogen bloat just when the heat comes in the summertime. So utilizing those organics to kind of keep the plant going, shifting now almost not away from chemical fertilizers, but really shifting away from the quantity of chemical fertilizers. Giant pumpkin, 1,000 pounds, we'll just say, it doesn't need 1,000 pounds of fertilizer. It needs a couple key things at key moments, and how a lot of the giant pumpkin growers will assess this is through tissue testing, where they'll actually take a sample of the leaf, the petiole in particular, send that off and kind of get an idea of what's actually in the plant. And of course, correlate that with their soil testing. And after you do it for a couple of years, you'll kind of learn that definitely giant pumpkins pull a lot of potassium out of the soil. So that's one key thing that you need. For cannabis and pumpkins, they do not need as much phosphorus as so many growers think that they need. We had a little bit of an issue in the giant pumpkin community, I would say, early on, where we had a couple growers have great success. So everyone gravitated to their soil test. We're like, oh, let's see your soil test. Let's see your tissue test. And they had very high phosphorus. Now, The issue with that from the scientific standpoint was, yes, they had big pumpkins, not arguing with that, but they had done that through organic matter additions, mainly manure-based, and they had brought their phosphorus really high. Well, what the issue was that people were correlating, if they have a giant pumpkin and this is their soil test, this is what I need. And that really wasn't the case. Yes, the potassium maybe have been higher, and that was a good thing, and some other aspects and ratios and balances were good. But their phosphorus, what growers didn't realize, and cannabis growers, I still kind of try to convey this to people, is they think that they need this high phosphorus level, and you really don't. It's a really hard concept to get across to people that have been told for years and years, phosphorus makes roots, and that's what you need, and it helps with the flowering. That's your bloom fertilizers. That's what you need, high phosphorus, high phosphorus, high phosphorus. And that's really just not the case. Back, I don't remember the exact year, but when I grew the state record here in Connecticut, and that was at the time, it was many years ago, but it was only 1,300 pounds compared to today's standards. But my phosphorus levels was almost nothing. It was, I think it was around 4 to 20, depending on when you took the sample, basically pounds per the acre. And I've got growers that are growing 10 times that and more than that. Because they think they need high phosphorus to get that growth, and you really don't. But it's always hard to run that control when it's like, oh, well, I'm not going to not add phosphorus because that grower added phosphorus and theirs was really tall, and those that grew a really big pumpkin. And it's just, the plants just can't utilize it as much as growers think. So that's where, again, where in the cannabis world, got a lot of growers that add bone meal, which is a great, source of phosphorus. It is. It's a waste product from the slaughter industry. So blood meal and bone meal, great things to be able to utilize. But if you're using it in an autoflower, or you're using it in a very quick cycle turnaround time for cannabis in particular, you're probably not getting as much phosphorus as you added. It takes a little while to break that down. Mm-hmm. Better for a living soil, better for a longer term grow operation. But we've got a lot of growers that are adding it, and yes, it is phosphorus, but you've got to look at plant available. And if you're doing a really quick turnaround and dumping the soil or throwing that out, you might be wasting some of your money there, where if you put it into a compost and kind of get it to break down, and then supplement it with the compost and or worm castings to kind of help buffer and keep the organics there as a stable source, that would probably be a better utilization. You could be getting a higher percentage of that. So it's kind of the education of growers, and I always love the bloom-based fertilizers that are like 45 to 50% phosphorus. It's crazy how concentrated some chemical fertilizers are that are out there that people and growers are utilizing pretty extensively, and really they just don't have to. Cannabis as well, it's the research I'm seeing shows a little bit more of a potassium need than, say, a high phosphorus need. So still waiting on some more of the research, more of the scientific literature to come out on that, but it's trending definitely in that direction. And I don't have any major harm of less phosphorus being added. And really it's a freshwater ground water contaminant. So it's got an environmental aspect. We're importing more phosphorus. It's a limited resource. So there's a whole bunch of other aspects to consider more than just your plant and your nutrients.
That's a great point around phosphorus. And we do see, like when we do a complete soil test, sometimes we'll see varying levels of phosphorus on the malic test, the acid extraction.
Yes.
But then we go to a saturated paste test and a water extraction, and that availability in some cases can be quite low. I think we target, off the top of my head, around 2 ppm, and sometimes we're at 0.8, and yet we still have very healthy, happy plants in an organic system. We do on occasion will need to supplement phosphorus, and when we do, that if we want something faster acting, that's typically something like fish hydrolysate, because that allows us to get phosphoric acid in there in a NOP approved format. But I do agree, especially outdoors in soil, because most of the growers we work with are indoors with no runoff. So that phosphate's not going anywhere. But I do agree that, especially outdoors, we really need to limit and control our phosphorus use just from an environmental perspective.
Sure. Or once you get it to a level, you don't have to keep adding it. Everyone thinks, I added a pound this year, I'll add a pound next year, and a pound the year after. There's a certain it levels off at a certain point. And yes,
Yeah.
I would say more so Rocky Mountain-ish area probably would benefit from some initial doses of phosphorus, but you don't have to keep adding it every year, which I think is the mentality that, oh, I added this and I had success. I have to keep adding this to have the same success. And it doesn't quite work that way.
I also find phosphorus sources tend to bring in heavy metals, which is not really a pumpkin concern so much as a cannabis concern.
Sure.
So just being aware of how you can limit that will also help.
Because what's essentially happening, a lot of it locally being United States, comes out of Florida. And the reason why we're importing more and more phosphorus is we still have a lot of phosphorus in Florida, but the purity is going down. Meaning as we're getting deeper and deeper into the phosphorus mines, they're getting more contaminants, more potential for heavy metals. It's still phosphorus, but it's cheaper right now, at least, to import in phosphorus than to refine it and to take out some of those impurities with the phosphorus mines that they're currently going through.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, bone meal is actually a very clean source of phosphorus now that I think about it, and fish bone usually is too.
Yep.
But when we talk about things like soft rock phosphate, we are absolutely getting heavy metals and other contaminants in there too. So that's a good point. Well, getting back to this comparison between giant pumpkins and cannabis, I do agree with you. The collaboration in the giant pumpkin community is phenomenal. It's on a whole nother level, even beyond what you see in cannabis. I think because it's always been legal, so people can talk about it. What have you found? I mean, you talked a little bit about some of this idea of what people call bro science. Yeah. What were some of the things that happened in the giant pumpkin community that would be similar to that bro science? Like just off the top of my head with cannabis, back in the day, people said if you apply Kool-Aid, your buds will be sweeter. We know that is not the case. What are some of those sorts of things that have worked their way through the giant pumpkin community over the years?
I would say just the trend, and it continues to be, just the lack of nutrients, but the reduction in volume of nutrients, the reduction in growing a monster-looking plant. Now, these plants get big, so I don't want it to think that they're keeping these really teeny tiny plants. But we don't need, I don't really want to see leaves that are 3 foot wide and 3 foot tall. You overadd nitrogen, yes, you will get a giant leaf and it will look huge, but it will typically speed age. And people were associating giant plants with giant pumpkins and giant everything. Everything should be bigger. It's not going to be a field pumpkin. It's going to be a giant pumpkin. And we noticed, again, through sharing information, that come June, July, yes, the plants looked ginormous. The plants looked huge. They were getting their pumpkins set. Their pumpkins were looking good. But a lot of times, if you went back to those patches now, the end of August, they had a lot of browning to their leaves. They had a lot more disease potential. They seemed to tail in their growth a lot quicker than, say, a weaker looking, and that's in quotes, a weaker looking plant that was just, I call it the right color green, the right height, not overly pushed in those regards. So that's kind of been one aspect there. And that's been proven out actually through giant pumpkin growers themselves, where, I grow a plant that's approximately 32 feet wide by 35 to 40 feet long. That's one plant. So that's about 1,000 to 1,200 square feet is one plant. Now, a lot of growers don't have that space, but they still want to try to grow a giant pumpkin. So there's a contest out there that's been running now for probably 7 years. It's called the 150 square foot contest. And what this concept is, and it's a really great concept, you're allowed 150 square feet to grow your pumpkin and your pumpkin plant. That's it. Everything's got to fit in there. Your vines, your pumpkin, you can't layer it. You can't have the pumpkin on a shelf and grow vines under it. The pumpkin and the plant has got to be contained in 150 square feet. Now, how you make the design, a triangle, a rectangle, a square, a diamond, whatever you come up with, that's up to you. But you're only allowed 150 square feet. So this has created a big challenge, because now you've got to fit the pumpkin, the plant, and everything is in a very small area. It's about the 10th of a size of, quote, a normal pumpkin plant, 1,000-ish square feet to potentially larger. So this has taught us a lot, that we've had a grower who I've actually known. He's out is in Massachusetts. He's got the world record for 150 square feet. So in that small area, he grew a 1,375 pound pumpkin in that small area. So this has got us thinking now. Yes, of course, it's not the world record at 2,700 pounds, but in 150 square feet, pumpkin and everything. How much excess are we growing the plant, and how much is a bigger plant potentially foregoing the pumpkin growth? This has been a really interesting concept. Now, of course, in 150 square feet, you've got to make sure everything's dialed in. Your water, you've got to you just have not a lot of room for error. If you have hail that comes in or something that damages a part of the plant, yes, you've got less odds of growing a bigger pumpkin. But there's been multiple 1,000-pound plus pumpkins grown in this very small area. So this has kind of got us away from thinking that each leaf produces 2 pounds or whatever. We'll just say each leaf produces 1 pound. This was an old school of thought that if I want a 1,000-pound pumpkin, I got to have 1,000 leaves. If I want a 2,000-pound pumpkin, I need 2,000 leaves. And it really doesn't quite work like that. If you're growing a 1,300-pound pumpkin in 150 square feet, each leaf is producing quite a bit because each square foot essentially is producing, I think it was like 6 or 7 pounds on average. So we've gotten away from the increasing of plant size concept to increasing efficiencies of plant. Now, I still grow in 1,000 square feet. I still think that's your best chance at the potential for a world record. But if you don't have that area, which I know many people don't, 150 square feet, when you start laying it out, it looks really small, and you don't think you can grow anything in that, but you could potentially grow 1,000+ pound pumpkin in that small area. So that's increased the amount of people we can get growing these, which again helps the sharing of information and just helps the whole community overall. So that's one of the key things of like bigger plant, bigger pumpkin. And I think cannabis growers were well ahead of that with their pruning methods and their limitations of being only in a grow tent. Of course, screen of green really isn't quite the option for pumpkin growers, but I call it the lily pad effect, where I want all my leaves kind of edge to edge. I don't want to have leaves shading other leaves. So kind of maximize that canopy, if you will. So it's a similar concept. Pumpkins weigh in pounds, cannabis weighs in grams, but it's still all about weight in the end. No one really sees the plant per se. They only see the production from the plant. So kind of, again, same concept there of having a life cycle to the plant, not just pushing the heck out of it early on. CO2, I've done some experiments with that. That's really improved growth on pumpkins. Again, gotten from the cannabis industry and greenhouse industry as well. Really trying to prove that, yes, some concepts are universal. They can help with pumpkins. They can help with cannabis. There can be some sharing of information as well across the two platforms.
When I was growing, and this was over a decade ago, and I want to say for people out there that are interested in trying it, I had an empty space in my garden at my farm back in the day, and I got seeds from friends of mine, actually Ryan Ewing out here in the Northwest. You may know Ryan. And Don in Geneva. I'm sure it's Emens or Emmons. I haven't seen them in a number of years.
I call it Emmons. I don't know.
Emmons, okay. Former world record holders themselves. And they were one of the people that told me, and this was, again, like probably 10, 15 years ago now, is less is more. That was something that she was really big on. And they were very accommodating and sharing. I grew, I'll just say it was a 725 pound pumpkin, which by giant pumpkin standards is a toddler. It's quite small. But I did it, with a lot of neglect and no soil testing in just the soil that we had at the farm, watered when we remembered and pruned it when I had a moment. So with the improvement in genetics and everything, I think it's very possible for a new grower, as a hobby, if they're not going for a world record, but just wants to experiment, to get out there and grow a really fun, large pumpkin that I got to say the kids had a ton of fun with. I fed it to the chickens afterwards. It was a blast. So I encourage people to, if you're interested in a hobby in growing and really want to see a plant actually physically grow in front of your eyes, it's incredible. Like, you'll go out there and it'll be the size, let's say, of a golf ball. The next day it'll be a baseball, and then the next day it'll be a beach ball. Like, it's just incredible. You literally watch it grow. It's a ton of fun. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. I would again promote for new growers. We've had a lot that have had success, and we're like, where did you come from? They're like, well, I found bigpumpkins.com would be the website. I know that Tad mentioned earlier. That would be probably your best single resource. Now, you are going to be inundated with information. There is a lot there, but I would say to try to make it a little easier on someone, if you go to the grower diaries in bigpumpkins.com, and try to find, because it's usually listed by, of course, everyone's handle name, and then it usually lists their general location. So if you have an idea of, the region, you might want to pick a couple growers in that region and kind of see what they do. And we've had a lot of growers come out of the woodwork. All of a sudden they show up at a way off, and no one's ever heard of them. And simply through the research that they've done online, literally through bigpumpkins.com, they've really been able to speed up the learning curve, or to kind of get some ideas of what people utilize in some areas. For those people in the Colorado area, just for a point of example, they're using a lot more shade netting. One, because they're higher elevation, and two, unfortunately, they get a lot of hail. So the shade netting protects the plants from hail and also shades them a little bit more because they don't need all the sun that they're getting and all the UV light that they're getting. So that's just one little tip and trick there for people in that region, where we're seeing it utilized more and more now in other areas, because pumpkins don't quite need all the sun that they're able to get even at sea level. But that's just one kind of little way to help forego season loss from a quick little hailstorm that comes by. The one thing that I would add, just to bring up, that anyone who's new to growing always thinks this is something I get all the fairs. I don't know where this started. I wish I knew where it started, because the marketing campaign on this is unbelievable. Everyone thinks that we milk feed pumpkins. You add milk, you inject milk, you do something with milk. I can tell you 100%, no one that I know, and I know many world record growers, no one injects milk at any time. Where I think that came about, looking back at it, is back in the day, someone grew some really big pumpkins, and they came up with this weird concept that they inject milk into their pumpkins. And because they kept winning year after year, people were like, well, he's winning, so I want to be like the winner. And I think the farmer was very clever in what he came up with, because if you know anything about milk in the summer, it ferments and it grows bacteria. And if you're injecting that into the vine, you're going to rot your vines out. So I think this grower was very smart in saying this is what he did, so that everyone went out and tried it and rotted all their vines out, and he kept winning. So as far as one thing that giant pumpkin growers do not do, that for whatever reason everyone thinks that we do, we don't inject any milk into the pumpkins. We don't inject any milk into the vines. We don't really do anything, particularly with milk. The only thing that you could use milk for, which was part of my research, was you can spray it on the leaves to reduce powdery mildew. That's about all. I remember
when that first came out. That was a big deal for people. In fact, actually, I was talking to a fruit grower yesterday who was experimenting with milk because of that paper. Now, the one complaint I have about milk is that it's white and it leaves a residue that looks a little like powdery mildew.
Yes.
But can you get the same success using lactobacillus, for example, or does it really is it the enzymes in the milk itself? Like, could I make a rice wash?
It's been shown, I know, with out of the cow, we'll call it raw milk. It's been shown with pasteurized milk. It's been shown with whey. It's been shown with all those. I'm not sure quite about that source there. The advantage to the milk is it's kind of like got a 3-part kind of active ingredient. It's basic. Powdery mildew likes an acidic kind of environment, so the basicness of the milk helps. Usually the fat, if you're using, I usually recommend whole milk if you're going to choose a milk, because that helps coat the leaves so you get a little better coverage. And it kind of binds up on the surface of the leaf, so that if powdery mildew is to land on the leaf, it doesn't recognize it's on host, and it just kind of stays dormant. It doesn't start to grow and produce. Yes, there's different concentrations you can utilize. The advantage to it, you can't burn a plant. I've had growers that put a high concentration, go out in high noon, super strong sun to try to burn the plants. Can't burn them. I'm not saying go spray in high noon, but you can utilize that. There's no real major negative side effects. If you go too high in concentration, it smells a little bit like a cheese factory, but a couple of rainstorms, that usually goes away. Yeah, there can be some residue, 20% or so. up to 40% milk, and the rest just water. Usually works just fine.
That's really helpful for folks. And then the other thing I was thinking of in regards to milk is the calcium needs of both cannabis and pumpkins. I wonder if that was part of it. We know, plants need calcium. Maybe the idea was that milk added calcium. I mean, we typically would use things like gypsum or lime to properly manage the agronomy in your field, to be clear. But I wonder if that's where it started. Yeah,
it's just an interesting concept that somehow universally at every fair I've worked at, answer questions, everyone's like, oh, you milk feed them. Like, it's just universal. Despite talking to hundreds of thousands of people and telling them we don't, there's always a couple people that come in and still think we do.
That is one thing I do want to bring up is it's really fun for folks, especially with kids. If you do want to grow a giant pumpkin, there's typically competitions in your area. Like I'm in the Seattle area and there's a few local way-offs. Like one is at the largest fair that we have in the area. And so you can take your pumpkin there. You can win cash prizes, though they're typically not going to compensate you for the amount of time that you put into the pumpkin or the cost. But it's a fun process and it's a really heartwarming community to be a part of. Everyone's really accommodating and friendly. So just want to
look up giant pumpkin way-offs. California's got the biggest one on the West Coast. That's Half Moon Bay. That's Columbus Day weekend somewhere. I think it's that Monday. That's probably the biggest one out West Coast. But look for giant pumpkins, and it's great to kind of meet the growers if you find out when the way-off is. Great to get ideas. They're usually very willing to share seeds. So just if you're interested in getting into the community, it is a very welcoming community.
Yeah, so I want to change directions here, and I'm not a big product guy. I mean, I have a company that sells products, but I always like to look at plants by what is the limiting factor of growth. Sometimes it's not fertility, but when it is fertility, I want to think about like what sorts of things do I like to have in my pantry? I mentioned gypsum. That's one of my favorite amendments for calcium. Like what do you as a grower like to keep in your quote unquote pantry to have on hand?
So I keep, I don't keep very much. I know it sounds weird. For pumpkins, something that probably isn't well known, and I try to tell people, I believe they're higher manganese consumers than most people realize. And that's Mn, not Mg. So not magnesium, but manganese, Mn. That is something it looks like, and continuing to do research, continuing to see some things that manganese sulfate is one I definitely make sure I keep on hand. That is probably something that most growers aren't realizing or even considering, I guess, at the most point. Speaking of gypsum for your calcium, the other key component, yes, you can add a lot of calcium and that's great, but really what helps get it into the plant is boron. So I always keep boron on hand because that helps with calcium availability. Now, when I say I keep boron on hand, I think I bought a 5-pound bag of Solubor or 4-pound bag of Solubor how many years ago, and it looks like I barely used it. I've used it quite a bit, but it's very small amounts. So we're looking at, again, that trend going back to our previous conversation. Keep these nutrients on hand, yes, but it doesn't mean I'm adding them pound by pound by pound by pound. Unlike a gypsum, I would add by pound. That one you can add quite a bit of. But some of these other ones, these specialty ones, very small amounts. I also like a little, and again, it's another little one, calcium nitrate for your nitrogen source. You need a nitrogen source. I don't care if it's blood meal. I don't care if it's fish emulsion. I don't care what you need. You need some sort of nitrogen source, particularly when you get a lot of heavy rain. We just actually made national news in Connecticut here. We just literally unexpectedly, no tropical storm, no hurricane, no anything. We had some towns not very far from here get over a foot of rain in a 24-hour period. Not rare. I should say very rare in this area. Not very common. It's a 1 in 1,000-year storm or something. But what that's going to do is that's going to flush a lot of your nitrogen out, as well as some other nutrients. But nitrogen is usually the first to go. So it's good to have a little nitrogen source just to give something back to help buffer that leaching effect that may have occurred in the event you get a heavy rainstorm. So I do like to keep some nitrogen source on hand for sure. I also do keep a little bit of it's a name brand wise. It's Plant Marvel. It's a K-Mag. It's a blend. I think it's a 15-5-30, somewhere around there. I think it's 15% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, 30% potassium. It's like the Miracle Grow. It's blue chemical fertilizer. Keep a little of that on hand. It's a good supplement. It contains a lot of microbes, nutrients. Just a quick little supplemental feed that kind of checks all the little boxes if I need to just give a general kind of supplementation feed. Now, what a lot of growers don't realize is probably what I rely on most is just compost that I've added. And when I say I've added compost, I have not added compost in 5 to 7 years. I got the levels up to where I wanted. It was leaf-based compost. Out here on the East Coast, we've got a lot of maple trees and some oak trees, and they produce a lot of leaves. We got to rake up. So mulch them up and let them sit for a couple years. The town actually provides a leaf-based compost that they suck up all the leaves and provide it back to the residents. So that's a great source. But I added a fair amount of that, added about 30 to 40 yards of that per 1,000 square feet. But I kind of did it once.
Wow.
And that's it. It was probably a little heavy. Looking back, probably a little on the heavy side. But I have not needed to add any compost for the last 5 to 7 years. I forget exactly. I have to look back at my records when I added it. But again, with that concept, to get to that level, and you don't need to keep re-adding. I don't need to add 20 yards of compost every single year to keep getting the same results. I've got the stable soil, shall we say, and now I'm just kind of supplementing with things.
Wow, you brought up a ton of great stuff, and I have some questions. So first off, with the K-Mag, is that like sulfate of potash magnesia?
Yeah, so it is
crystals, because the stuff
it's their own proprietary blend, I'm sure, but it is basically a potassium sulfate, really get the 30% plus potassium, and then it's got just a general mix of everything else. Let's see if I can get you the exact.
Okay, because that sounds a little different than K-Mag, as I understand.
Yeah, it's I should say it's the Plant Marvel's version of K-Mag, I guess is the best way to put it.
Okay, because K-Mag, I know they make an organic version. I just know this because we sell it.
It
dissolves in water. It looks like little crystals. That might be a little different than what you're describing, just for people who are listening and trying to find the product. You mentioned calcium nitrate. The other thing around nitrogen I want to mention, my good friend Bryant Mason, who's a wonderful agronomist, talks about how nitrogen is primarily cycled based around temperature. Mm-hmm. And so if you get cold temperatures, you may also need to supplement nitrogen as well as the leaching effect that you mentioned. So I wanted to touch on that. And then with trace minerals, I just want to mention with cannabis, on our target recommendations, we haven't been adding in trace minerals because we typically get some from the compost. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're a little bit low. And again, I'm talking about mostly indoor soilless media, just for comparison for people who are listening to. But when we've recently started adding some of those back in at low levels, but we have found with a lot of cannabis growers is they add too much, and too much is much worse than too little. And I just want to emphasize that, because when you get too high on, especially specifically boron, you can really create toxicities that will do more damage than good. But we have started making a manganese recommendation on our soil test for folks, because with cannabis, we are seeing actually that a little bit of a manganese, hunger, more so than we had realized. So that is something that we also are focused on with our cannabis recommendations. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. But yeah, that's wonderful. So you're relying primarily on creating a healthy soil with good levels of organic matter, good biology from the compost and the way that you're managing that soil. And then you're supplementing that with, based off of your soil test, it sounds like, and tissue testing.
I call it the soil hydroponics concept, which I know is going to drive a lot of cannabis growers crazy, because soil and hydroponics don't seem like they meet. But kind of using the soil as the basis of most of the nutrients, the nutrient load, I should say, and then hydroponically or supplementing in these very light dose fertilizers as the plants need or as the weather conditions warrant, or as the plant develops at a certain stage. Like I was saying, as a pumpkin grows, it needs a little bit more potassium. So kind of spoon feeding and dosing a little bit of that, maybe a little bit later in the season, but not really adding hundreds and hundreds of pounds of fertilizer, really just kind of feeding what the plant needs and what the plant it might be running short on, or what the microbes just can't keep up with. Like you're saying, early in the season when the soil's cold, after a heavy rain event, the microbes will make nitrogen, but in those conditions, maybe they just need a little help, or the plant just needs a little bit so it doesn't go hungry, and then it back off and let the microbes kind of refeed into the ecosystem there. So it's not overriding everything and not being completely dependent on everything I feed it, but just that supplemental feed for the pumpkin, or cannabis would be in the same realm.
Great. Did you want to mention the Plant Marvel product so people can find it if they are curious?
Yeah, so I can send it to you if you want. It's Plant Marvel Nutriculture. It is called their K-Bag spoon feeding soluble fertilizer, 15,530 plus micronutrients. Okay, I'm not sponsored by them. I wish I was sponsored by somebody, but not sponsored by them. But that is one that has a good general, I'll just say, Miracle-Gro like fertilizer that really dissolves well in water. It's great for a quick feed. It's great for just a good supplemental feed there.
Not organic, just for anyone.
Unfortunately, not organic. Yes.
Just to clarify, but yes, that is an option. Changing directions again, we had talked about phosphorus a little bit, and it's really an issue of maintaining low levels of phosphorus availability, more so than having this massive reserve that, we talked about. People were over applying it earlier. What are your thoughts around mycorrhizal fungi? I know it's associated with increased nutrient uptake of a lot of nutrients, but phosphorus is the big one that people talk about when they talk about mycorrhizal fungi. I know from talking to pumpkin growers, a lot of them were adding it at all the different, for the secondary vines at all the nodes. What are your thoughts around not just the use of mycorrhizal fungi, but also the application rates? Do we need to be adding it every planting directly to the roots? What do you think? So
for mycorrhizae in general, it does phosphorus really well as copper. I think is the second one it helps a lot with. What it does in general, for those just listening, to give you a quick background, is it basically creates a better net in the soil. So a pumpkin root, a cannabis root is quite large, and it's really the root hairs that do a lot of the absorption. Well, the fungus is really fine and really helps increase soil contact. That really helps be able to come in contact with phosphorus so it can absorb it. The advantage is the fungus will give the phosphorus essentially to the plant or host plant, cannabis, pumpkin, whatever. And in exchange, the plant gives the fungus sugar so the fungus can grow better. So the fungus is getting sugar from the plant, and the plant's getting phosphorus, maybe some copper from the fungus. So it's a true symbiotic relationship, meaning they're both benefiting. The fungus loves it because it's in the soil, can't do photosynthesis. Sugars are hard to come by. Well, the plant's got all its leaves up above ground, so it's able to absorb all the sun, and it's got excess sugars, hopefully. Then it gives the fungus there. So it's a great symbiotic relationship. How much do we need to add, or how much damage are we doing to it potentially? As I mentioned, these really fine networks like a fish net. Well, if you till your soil, of course, you're going to be chopping up a lot of those mycelium, a lot of those hyphae, a lot of those kind of nice little network that's kind of created. So what pumpkin growers were doing is they were adding it at every leaf node, because wherever there's a leaf node for giant pumpkins, as well as some other pumpkins, they will set down a root. So the concept was, when that root comes out, we want the fungus there so it can start to form that association really quickly. However, it seems like in what I've seen, at least from the giant pumpkin standpoint, is that because the plants grow so aggressively, I'm not sure how much of a benefit the plants are getting from the phosphorus uptake. I think it might be a little more limiting, shall we say, that if I add a liquid feed of a little phosphorus, I think that's more plant readily available to the host plant, because they're growing, quote, so fast. So for adding mycorrhizae, I used to add it, in the planting hole and at the vine, but building up enough in your soil, there's going to be a lot of natural mycorrhizae, potentially a lot of natural bacteria in there. So I personally don't add any of it anymore to my pumpkin plant to as a vine barrier or anything like that. So I feel creating the organic matter base that I have is creating a favorable environment for those all to kind of live in. Where I think mycorrhizae offers by far the best advantage, and this is a little different than cannabis, a little different than pumpkins, is for foresty trees. So in forest regions where there's trees growing, where really nutrients are very hard to come by, and there's a very stressful condition there, because yes, they might be recycling some of the leaves and to bring some organic matter up, but forest region, you dig down in a forest, you get down a couple inches, it can be a very difficult soil to really support large plants. So I think having the mycorrhizae in that instance is very beneficial because one, you're not tilling up the soil very often. Those trees are going to establish that mycelium quite well. They're not going to be tilled up. They're going to benefit from the stressful conditions that they're in. And I think that is definitely where mycorrhizae can really offer a potential benefit. In kind of the annual producing areas, I think the benefits might be more limiting, just simply of the general practices that we do, unfortunately. To get that true establishment there, I'm not sure exactly how much of a benefit that's truly offering in annual. There might be some initial benefits, but long range, as far as mining all the phosphorus, by the time they produce all that mycelium, get all those little hairs out there, odds are the plant's probably going to be to term, and it's going to be ready, quote, for next season, and you've probably established enough of those resting spores in there for the following year.
Some other thoughts around mycorrhizal fungi, and feel free to correct me too if you say anything that you disagree with, but mycorrhizal fungi, high levels of phosphorus applications will limit mycorrhizal infections. So if you're applying phosphoric acid, for example, you may limit the plant's desire, I guess, or need to form that relationship with the plant. And it is a symbiotic relationship, so it needs to come in direct contact with the root. There's no point in scattering it throughout your soil. In addition, these fertilizers that listed on there, don't assume that the spore count is high enough to even get infection. A lot of times they'll put in just a pinch and then say, with mycorrhizal fungi on the label. So you really want to get a specific inoculant for the specific type of plant you're growing. And that means if you're growing, the good news is most of these are endomycorrhizal fungi, but you want to get the right species, which is, it could be Rhizophagus irregularis, Glomus intraradices, Glomus mossiae. They're specific ones and it's the same for fruit trees, cucurbits, tomatoes, cannabis. They all utilize the same sort of sets of endomycorrhizal fungi. Fortunately, you just want to make sure when you look on the label, what you're getting matches what you actually need, because I've seen products that contain both endo and ectomycorrhizal fungi, and you may have 50 spores per cc of endomycorrhizal and then like 1.2 million spores of ectomycorrhiza, which is specific to conifers and these forestry situations. And so they're not really forming a relationship with your plant. So you do need to do a little research if you are going to use it. So
if you're resting no, that's good. If you're resting in an area and you kind of want to build up the mycorrhizae in that area, the quote quickest, zinnias, which is a beautiful flower, is got one of the highest mycorrhizae association plants and really can help build up numbers as quick as possible, because I believe that's what most of the more commercial producers of said mycorrhizae are using, actually zinnia roots. So if you find little root fragments, they're probably zinnias, because of the increased association and ease of association, I should say, that those have. So if you're resting in an area and really want to build up that mycorrhizae, inoculate it, your zinnia seeds, plant your zinnias, enjoy your zinnias, and you'll be doing good for the soil as well.
That's a really useful tip. And then the last thing I want to mention is I did see some research out of Italy talking about using mycorrhizal fungi in conjunction with cannabis. And what they found was an increased uptake of heavy metals, which makes sense to me based on understanding the pathways of how heavy metals are taken up and how cannabis is a dynamic accumulator and how mycorrhizal fungi also helps increase that nutrient uptake. So if you are in a state where you're being regulated for heavy metals and you're using soilless media that contains some heavy metals, I would caution folks before adding mycorrhizal fungi in some of the tighter regulated states, just for that reason, something to consider.
Yeah, I want to say I've got something on the channel on that. Maybe it could be the same study.
I reached out to the researcher. I tried to get it on. I tried to get her on the podcast, but I didn't have any luck with that. But yes, I believe so, and I'll try and track it down though before we publish this. But I think at least for us, heavy metals is a bigger and bigger issue in the cannabis industry. I don't know. Yes. I see I just searched heavy metal on your YouTube channel as well, and I got a bunch of hits. So there is some information on there. Did you have any highlights regarding heavy metals that you wanted to touch on for growers?
It's something that growers should be looking at in their COAs. That's my biggest recommendation there. It is definitely something that growers, consumers, growers, whoever need to be mindful of, that can be an issue.
Yeah.
If you type mycorrhizae for cannabis production, I do have the video on it. And let's see, it could be, they sound Italian names. It was from 2005. It might looking at cadmium, nickel, and chromium, significantly enhancing translocation of those.
Yeah. So be careful, folks, if you're thinking about using these products, and then also be aware with heavy metals that compost and water are probably two of your biggest sources of contamination, in addition to fertilizers. But I typically see higher levels coming in from compost and from water sources than anything. So I always start with those two things. Well, we've been chatting for a while here. Yeah. I know you're a busy guy. Was there any last little pointers or comparisons that you wanted to make between giant pumpkin growers and the cannabis industry, cannabis growers?
No, I would say, again, if you're a cannabis grower, to honestly check out bigpumpkins.com would be a great resource there to just see what the giant pumpkin community is doing now. It is a little more seasonal because they're not really growing indoors, but that's something there to look at. And for cannabis growers themselves, again, the YouTube channel there, DeBacco University, would be something I'd recommend them to take a look at. I try to respond to every comment. It gets tough at certain times. But if you type a comment in, I do try to get back to you at least one time. If you ask a follow-up question, I probably will miss that one. But I appreciate you having me on the podcast here. And if people have other specific questions, or if you want to have me on again, I'd always be willing to come on for another round there, Tad.
I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the work that you're putting out. And please do reach out to Matthew and check out his YouTube channel and check out his course at University of Connecticut.
Thank you.